Well, again, thank you. Welcome to this first session of the Farmer to Farmer Intensive. Reducing Tillage is our focus for today. We are excited to have this time to learn peer-to-peer. That's the whole goal of today. So we today have Jen Salinetti from Woven Roots Farm in Tyrringham, Massachusetts. We have Noah Kellerman from Alprilla Farm in Essex, Mass, and Doug Wolcik, formerly of Gaining Ground Farm, and now a new transplant up into the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. We want to, discuss our new approaches that they'll discuss their new approaches that they've been experimenting with, as well as all their, a little bit overview of their farm and the no-till practices they're using. So just before we get started, we want to make sure that we acknowledge all of our conference sponsors who help make this event possible. We encourage you to support them and also mention how much you appreciate their support of NOFA Mass. We do have a great virtual vendor page where you can check out all these vendors and get some cool discounts. So please visit our vendor marketplace. And then we've got some incredible items. We've got some incredible items to bid on in our online auction. So if you haven't already checked that out, go over there and bid early, bid often. Most importantly, we want to thank you all, especially our members, for joining us today, spending your weekend with us, and participating in this event. We want to make sure that everyone gets their questions answered. So the layout of today's event is basically we have 3 presentations. We're going to go through all of them back to back and then save questions for the end. So we'll have, a good amount of questions. We're hoping at least a half an hour. So feel free to put those questions into the chat function. We may invite you to come off of mute towards the end to ask your questions. And just so you know that if you do come on and speak, then please put yourself back on mute because we're trying to preserve sound quality for the recording. And of course, NOFA Mass aims to make our racial equity statement a living document that drives our work to help heal the harm that racism has caused in the food system. And so we urge everyone to participate as allies to BIPOC communities. And we have some benchmarks that we would like to hold ourselves to, which is to provide resources to BIPOC communities, organizations that are working to feed their communities, be a partner and stand against white supremacist behavior and actions, and work to dismantle racism within the food system. And by working together, we can dismantle racism in the food system, in the Commonwealth, and we can work to feed and serve the commonality of us all. Of course, we use this screen in the background, this interactive map, as a way to acknowledge that the land was inhabited prior to European colonization, and we would all do well to remember the millennia of history that came before us. And so we use this to help you educate yourself on the lands that you are now occupying. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jen.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. It's really a pleasure to be sharing space with you, recognize some faces and names, and I'm excited about some new ones. One of our former farm crew members has actually joined us today, so Mac, if you want to jump in and at any point, feel free. Okay, I'm going to start right away with, I'm going to share my screen with you. Most of the time I'll be sharing some images along the way, giving you an overview of the farm. And let's see. Okay. How's that look? Can you see this? Okay, great. So as I said, my name is Jen Salinetti. I am co-founder, farmer, director of education and community engagement at Woven Roots Farm. We are located in present-day Tyrringham, Massachusetts, as Doug said. That is on the western end of Massachusetts. We are on the Mohican land. This is unceded territory of the Mohican people, and specifically the Stockbridge Munsee Band, who was forcibly removed and currently lives in Wisconsin. So that is a little map that you can see where we're pinned, is just to give some perspective, west of Springfield, near Albany, in unceded Mohican land. So I'm having difficulty changing my slide. Okay. So the way that our farm has operated has been through a number of different perspectives over the last 20 years. We have been a farming operation for 15 years, full-time farming. The first 5 years that we were farming, we were not using the same practices that we keep now. And there was a process over time, that 5 years, until we fully went to a hand scale farm. And through that time, we were always looking at ways to be able to center our work in the place of reciprocity, through land care, through taking care of our community members, nourishing our community members through vegetables, as well as education. And so this cyclical way of living and being within our landscape, as well as with each other, has been something that has always been on the foreground of our mind. So as I said, we started 20 years ago, we started farming. 15 years ago, we went to full-time farming. And 10 years ago, well, now 11 years ago, we moved to a CSA model. And so part of that involved, we waited to become a CSA because we wanted to be in a place of really understanding how to work intimately with the land and one another before we were starting to make that commitment to feeding our community members. Prior to that, we had a farm stand, and we were focusing a lot more on wholesale to restaurants. And we shifted our focus in 2010 towards really finding ways to center our work around feeding our neighbors, our community members, our marginalized community members, and began doing that in partnership with some of our local community organizations, including Berkshire Grown. So we have maintained a solidarity share fund for our marginalized community members since 2010. In 2020, we exceeded 200 CSA members. I'm sure a number of you who are farming experienced some positive, I hope that some of you experienced some positive growth, particularly in the CSA realm. We were able to expand our CSA membership through extending our community partnerships and reaching a greater amount of marginalized community members. Almost 90 households last year were reached through our Solidarity Share Fund. So we are doing all of this on what we have farm as open farm land is less than an acre and a third of land. The property that we sit on is just under 10 acres, and we have 5 acres of that which we technically own, and another little less than 5 acres that we long-term lease. So the way that we care for the land and for each other is through an ethical, social, cyclical, and logical lens. We are, and I'll go through these quickly to just give you an overview. But these are the guiding principles that lead us in our ethical path. We have we center our work with being in relationship with the land, not specifically soil per se, but recognizing all of us as an interconnected web of an ecosystem, a living, breathing ecosystem that we all work together in. And so before we started this, as I mentioned, the first 5 years that we were farming, we were not using the methods that I am now laying out to you. And the image that you see on the left is an example of the way our field looked after heavy rains when we were tilling the land. As you can see, there was significant pooling. The land that we were initially growing on is not the same land that we're on now. It was considered muck and unsuitable for growing it. And we, over a course of 14 years, were able to change that ecosystem to go from 2% organic matter up to almost 10% organic matter. And so that's an image on the left that you're seeing prior to instilling our hand scale practices. The image on the right here is an example of our fields, a newly planted field after a significant rainfall. And I'm trying to remember if it was the year that Mac was here, but this rainfall was actually, we experienced 6 inches of rain in less than a 24-hour period. We got almost 2 inches of rain during a lunch break. And when we came out into the field, this is what our field looked like. So you can see there's a drastic difference between the way water is moving and engaging with the landscape. This example of disturbing the soil as little as possible can be seen in a number of different ways. The image on the left here is soil that has a tremendous amount of structure to it. There's a number of different aggregates in it. You can see remaining root structures in there, and there's a little worm even peeking out. On the right-hand side is soil that has not been maintained that way, and it's completely lacking in soil structure and aggregates. On the right, there's a picture of just an example of what our crops will do in various times of need. And so this is this particular storage radish actually reached out pretty deeply. We had a significant drought, and we were able to maintain the health and integrity of our crops, very much so because of the way that we had been caring for the land. And so this example is a root that has stretched quite a far bit down in order to be able to access water during a drought season. Here's another little example of just the way working with no-tilled environments offer a tremendous amount of organic activity, infiltration pathways for water and for nutrients versus in a plowed session that has a plow pan that is very limited. And we actually experienced that plow pan when we first opened up land here from when it had been under agricultural production from 30 years prior. We experienced that initial plow pan, and within less than 2 years, we're able to move through that plow layer. We focus on encouraging biodiversity on the farm, not just through the crops that we grow. We have about 40 different crops, over 70 different varieties amongst those crops. And we have annual and perennial production, much more in annual production. But within the fields, we keep a close rotation cycle. So the same plant family is not experiencing a given bed space for at least 4 cycles. And so we have that very strategically placed in our fields. But then we also create habitat for pollinators. We maintain an apiary here. We have both domesticated animals, a small amount of domesticated animals, chickens, and then we also encourage spaces for the native animals to be in coexistence with us. So these are killdeer eggs that every year come back. Multiple hatchings of them occur directly in our beds. And I learned not until like a few years ago that killdeer are very specific about where they lay their eggs. They lay in the ground, and they also need to have a lot of trust of where they are putting their nest, of course, and they seek out undisturbed areas. So I am always really happy to see the multiple hatchings of killdeer that we have here each year. We also engage really closely with all sorts of animal species. We've seen considerably over the years just how much our increase of native habitat has expanded, and it's been something that we're starting to track more of. We have people specifically looking to see the various birds that have come into our area that had no longer been in existence until, or at least living here until we started farming in this area. And then we also, amongst our fields, have various areas for encouraging just native plant material. So milkweed, for example, we have a number of different patches that have expanded over the years, and this is not a monarch, but our monarch population, it grows each year. So keeping another one of our guidelines is to keep the soil covered as much as possible. There are a number of different ways that we do that. Probably the primary way that we do that is actually through our cash crops. And so our planting systems are really intense. I'll give a little example of that in a few minutes. But we try to actually utilize the area in a way that is both a cash crop as well as a benefit to sequestering carbon and keeping the soil covered. We use mulching as well, both living mulch as well as, well, really it's all living mulch. So wood chips that we use, we wait at least 2 years until we lay any wood chips or leaves into our garden beds so that the indigenous mycorrhizal fungi can populate the area and start to actively work to break those down. And then we use we incorporate a number of different other living crops such as alfalfa and buckwheat and rye and white clover and red clover amongst our plants. Watching and observing is something that we are always intimately involved with. We recognize ourselves not as separate from nature, but a part of nature, and learning from the natural rhythms around us is a center point of our work. And giving back more than we take is a significant focus of ours. So whether that's how we are contributing to the soil in our plantings and our intercropping systems, or educating our community members and creating a space of solace and refuge for community members. We focus a lot on the social aspect of the work that we do. We believe really strongly that everyone deserves the right not just to access to nutrient-dense, vibrant food, but to a sense of place and understanding of our relationship with the land. The cyclical component of our work is really significant. We try to keep our bed system, which is they're 50-foot beds, 30 inches wide, 12-inch aisles, systemized throughout the entire farm. But as most of our crops are done, most of our planting is done through transplanting. So we have about 75% of our crops are transplant. They usually go from seed into a cell pack like this and then transplanted out in the field. The other 25% is done through direct seeding on the farm. And all of that, the turnover of that is anywhere, of a given bed space is anywhere from 1 day 24 hours to 4 days. And that is one of the ways that we are able to magnify our efforts on less than an acre and a third. We do a fair amount of intercropping. So this example on the left are peas growing trellis, and then on the inside of the pea trellis area, we have some salad mix. That's another way that we will incorporate mulching. And then we do a fair amount of season extension on the farm. There's actually something growing without supplemental heat all throughout the winter here in greenhouse space. And then our field extension occurs all the way up through December. And so that's another way that we relate to the seasons.
About
yeah.
5 minutes.
Awesome. Thank you for that heads up. So the logical component of our work, I've already been touching upon a little bit. Here's a okay overview of some of the farm. And again, you can see some of the systemization of it, of both integration of perennial and annual crops, the 50-foot rows. We maintain, if I had an error, I could show you, there are aisles that are cover crops between sections of bed space. So to help with erosion control. And so there isn't ever a really big swath of land that is open here. This is just like a quick breakdown of tools and just an example of the way that we are primarily working here is the more intensive method using the tools over here. I give this as an example to just for people to consider input costs and what it means to be able to transition to a hand scale or to begin on a hand scale method. The input cost is significantly less. We have recently added a compost spreader to our method rather than doing just hand movement of compost, since we incorporate so much compost into our bed space. And so that has been the most significant input that we have made over the last actually 15 years of farming. Here's a little example of the more intensive way of working within bed space. And so on the left is more of a typical conventional way of spacing in a field space, which yields about 240 heads of lettuce. And then the same amount of space in the system that we have of 30-inch beds, 12-inch aisles, we are yielding 450 heads of lettuce. This is what it looks like when we first transition a bed space into a lettuce crop, for example. You'll see on the left, there are soaker hoses. There are 3 soaker hoses. That's the extent of our irrigation on the farm. When a transplant goes into the ground, we water that area for about 10 minutes with the soaker hoses and then move on to the next bed. And the crops do not need to experience any other water throughout the year. We will also use an oscillating hose just to germinate seeds in a given bed space. So again, it's just for a very temporary period of time. Here's an example of just so this is, these lettuces when they start out look like this. When they're at their full crop size, you can see there's hardly any ground space that is visible. And that is our goal, to keep the soil covered as much as possible by utilizing cash crops. So in a given harvest space for the lettuce, here's a little breakdown of just how much we're getting per square foot, almost twice as much as we would be in a single row, which allows us to be able to regularly maintain about $100,000, a minimum of $100,000 per acre on our farm. And that is my summary for the moment. I can stop sharing my screen.
That was great, Jen.
Thank you.
Yeah, next up, we'll talk to Doug.
I just have to, oh, stop share. Here we go. Okay.
Great. Welcome, Doug. Wolcik.
Hey, Doug, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay.
It sounds like you're breaking up a little bit. We might have to take your video off.
Cool. How's this look, Doug? Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, yeah, currently I'm up in the Northeast Kingdom, so excuse my internet capabilities. It's a rural community here. I'm in Craftsbury, Vermont. And I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm doing up here, but I'd like to start with the work that I have been doing at Gaining Ground for the last 8 seasons. So today, for the last 8 years, I've been managing at Gaining Ground. In this time that I've been managing here, we transitioned from a traditional tractor farm to no-till in 2016. So we have 5 complete seasons under our belt in no-till production. And we really discovered the importance of working with living soils and the ideal practices, or we feel like we've been using some ideal practices for enhancing biological activity on the farm. Tell you a little bit about Gaining Ground. So Gaining Ground is a nonprofit, grows food for organic produce for hunger relief with help from volunteers of all ages and abilities who come and work and learn in our fields. So in a typical season, we would host about 2,500 volunteers on the farm. Every day we have volunteers, all ages, abilities who come and get to experience work on the farm. We're building community through this volunteer program, and people get to experience, what it's like to work on a small scale agricultural farm experience. And they also get to, get outside and participate in a social mission of growing food for their neighbors that, need food or don't have access to food like some of the other people. So I just finished my last week at Gaining Ground, and I'm now currently up in Craftsbury, Vermont, and I'm starting with my partner Bread Seed Farm. In year 1, that'll be a half-acre no-till regenerative farm. We're taking a lot of the practices that we've used at Gaining Ground, but we're going to be a for-profit farm. This is where our friends and family are, so we decided to make the move back up to the Northeast Kingdom. So Gaining Ground is in Concord, Massachusetts. It's 3 acres. We have half an acre under cover. Throughout the past 5 years, we've built 4 hoop houses, 1 rolling tunnel that covers 3 growing areas, and we have 10 caterpillar tunnels on the property. So we're able to grow and donate food 12 months per year. We do 130,000 pounds of produce per season. And we're donating to 15 different recipient partners. That's a combination of shelters, food pantries, and direct distribution. Most of those organizations are located in Boston, Lowell, and the Metro West. We donate, in the height of the season, 3 days a week, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and 5 organizations come and pick up the food, on each one of those days. I mentioned the volunteer program, where we typically have 2,500 volunteers. Obviously, with COVID, that didn't happen this year, so that was a huge hit to our labor force. Typically, in a typical season, we would have myself with 4 other farmers working with those 2,500 volunteers to, execute the farm's need of growing for 3 acres, harvesting 125,000 plus pounds of produce and doing the donations. This year we didn't have the option of having the volunteers, so we hired 3 additional farm staff. totaling 7 farmers on the 3 acres, and were able to maintain what the farm needed to have a slight increase in production and a slight increase in donations. And we really didn't skip a beat. I would say if COVID happened in year 1 or year 2 of our transition to no-till, it would have been exceedingly more difficult. But because we were in year 5 and we had systems and the soil is functioning at a high level, we were able to really maintain all levels on the farm without, any stress or, extra energy or inputs needed other than hiring the 3 additional summer staff members. So here's some of our production numbers over the past 8 seasons. So I just want to start with this. It works. 2013, this was pre-no-till. That was my first year on the farm. We were producing 34,000 pounds on the same amount of acreage that we're growing on currently. 2016 was the first year of no-till, and we were able to, right off the bat, make a big jump to 60,000 pounds of food. I think by setting up the no-till, it got us, we needed to be able to focus and establish the permanent beds and it developed a greater understanding of the farm and the farm layout. And we were just able to be much more efficient with our use of space than we were when we were tractor farming. We relied on that tractor too much to clean things up, correct mistakes we had. We weren't as intensive on, cropping out crops as fast as we could because we knew if they got weedy, we could just, plow it back in and start back over with the tiller and the tractor. So in 2016, we did that transition and we jumped to 60,000 pounds immediately. And then just each year has got better and better, significantly better and better. So 2017, we had a 33% increase to 80,000 pounds. 2018, we grew 100,000 pounds. 2019 up to 125. And 2020, just last year, we did 130,000 pounds of food on the same 3 acres. We didn't have as large of an increase this year because our focus has transitioned to growing greens and fresh crops and less potatoes and less winter squash. So, that's another, big pro to the no-till, that we're being able to produce lighter weighing food in more abundance, and our ability to donate fresh goods to food pantries, because every single year after the season, we're communicating with these recipient organizations. Are we supplying you with the food that you need, that your recipients want? Is the food being taken? Is it being used? We're trying to trace that food as long as possible to decrease the waste and make sure that this food is used. It is used when it's fresh and when it's, at its most nutrient dense. So we kept hearing that potatoes is not a thing that they need. They can get those in abundance. So we've altered our crop plan to just grow more greens, more tomatoes, more of the fresh things that work well in the market garden in no-till systems, and that the recipients need and can use and that they want, really. So our inspiration started in 2015. We had been reading about no-till, but it's scary to jump in. You think you've been relying on this tractor. You think that you're just going to be overtaken by weeds, that it's hard to maintain the fields without tractor, mechanization, cultivation. So 2015, we built our first tunnel. And this was really the inspiration for us moving forward and moving the no-till system from that initial hoop house that we built, moving it out to over the 3 acres, covering the whole farm. 2015, we built the tunnel, just like Jen mentioned, 30-inch beds, 12-inch pathways. This gave us 8 beds that were 50 feet long in the tunnel. And we just saw immediate success. In that first year alone, we had 50% reduction in weed pressure and, a 25% increase in yield from our tomatoes and our greens over the winter. Plus, it allowed us to grow food all winter long because, hunger never stops. Just because the farms aren't open and growing food in the winter doesn't mean that the pantries don't need food or fresh local food. So with the immediate success that we saw in the hoop house, we said this is a no-brainer. We need to start rolling this out into the 3 acres as quickly as possible. So moving forward, what we did was 2016, we just took an acre a year in 2016, 17, 18, and took it from tractor, mechanization and moved it into no-till slowly. And slowly over these years started to accumulate the tools, the infrastructure, and the systems that we needed to maintain our production levels or increase production levels at an acre per time. And with, we were way differently staffed back in the early days. We had 3 farmers with the same amount of volunteers. So as our, profits and quotations and yields increased, we've been able to bring on more farmers for longer seasons, for a longer season with working with this no-till system. So that one house, that one trial run was really our inspiration, and just the immediate results that we saw was the key to our success and rolling this out over the whole farm. And the no-till just really aligned with our farm goals. We wanted to grow healthy food for our community in 2 ways. Number one is to donate this food to the food pantries that we're partnering with, but also to expose our volunteer community to what growing healthy food in a healthy ecosystem looks like. We can make great impact because we have 2,500 volunteers, people rolling through the farm each day or each season, some volunteers every single day. So we wanted to show them that how much food we can grow in a small area, it can make a huge impact, that anybody can go home because we don't have any tools or, equipment that they can't access in their backyard. And the big difference, we wanted to excite people and show them that they can make a difference just by growing a very small plot in their backyard. Everything was scalable. What we were doing on the farm could be repeated by any volunteer that came out to the farm to experience working at gaining ground. So we wanted to work with nature, start healing the land. The land that we are on is the birthplace of Henry David Thoreau. The history of it is that this farmland has been in production for over 300 years. Concord was, a huge agricultural community 300 years ago, and a lot of the food went into Boston at, this time. And the history of our land is that it was in a perennial farm of asparagus and strawberries. So, in 2012, 2013, when I was first starting out, the soil was pretty depleted from, constant, mechanization and, not putting in what the land had given, not putting back in what the land had been taken from for hundreds and hundreds of years. So in 2013 and beyond, we started moving towards working with the land instead of against it. As everybody knows, we didn't want to spray, we didn't want to use chemicals, 1 for our recipients, 2 for the volunteers that are coming out to the farm, and 3, just as our philosophical ideals as farmers is I don't want to spray that stuff. And then, a major goal is to grow more food, small acreage, work with our other free labor, the other volunteers, which is the microorganisms and the earthworms, and to harness all the ecological resources that this piece of land has to give us. So I heard a speaker, I go to conferences and attend these conferences, and I heard a speaker say no-till is gaining ground. He didn't mean that it was gaining ground on our farm, but he just meant that it's building momentum. Regenerative agriculture is really popular, and here's some definitions of that. It's replacing mechanical tillage with biological tillage, working with the mycorrhizal fungi to build soil fertility to grow healthier plants, and developing cropping systems for high output while sustaining and improving the soils over time. So why don't we till? It's so easy, it's so convenient, it creates the perfect seed bed, it warms the soil, it's light, airy, fluffy. I like to think of it a giant eraser. You can correct any mistakes that you made up, but why we don't want to do it is tilling is burning up organic matter. It's a major disruption. It's like every natural disaster all at once in the soil. So every act of tillage equals a loss of 1% of organic matter. At Gaining Results, we've been increasing organic matter at minimum 1% annually across the farm. And this is really ties into an environmental issue. It's the battle of tillage is a carbon loss, and not tilling is carbon sequestration. So I like to, think of the soil as, I have 3 areas to attack it, or 3 areas to manage the soil. And I like to break them down this way. We have our, physical, which is addressing the soil structure. So at Gaining Ground, we were incredibly sandy. We couldn't hold nutrients, or we had poor water retention. It was really dry in the early days. So primarily, this has been adjusted through compost application, heavy compost application at first, 1 to 2 inches, deep on the bed tops, and reducing that each year as the soil, the physical structure of the soil starts to increase and there's better tilth there. We've seen better water holding capacity and better root growth, and it's responded in incredible ways. Secondly was the biological, just like Jen said, as little disturbance as possible. The broad fork is our most aggressive tool on the farm, and that tool, the great thing about the broad fork is that it's making itself obsolete. The more you use it, the less you need it. So we've been the parts of the farm that have been in no-till longer do not require broad forking anymore, as the soil is, performs as if it was tilled. It's light, it's airy, it's fluffy, it holds moisture really well, it holds nutrients really well. So we're developing a broad forking system where we only are broad forking before, deep rooting crops, carrots, parsnips, and the likes of those. And then the last area of attack is chemical through in-depth soil testing and amending. So we like to look at soil testing 2 ways. So kind of how I broke it down for the crew. Amending is amending for the soil. This is a sustainable act. And then fertilizing is, providing fertilizer for the plant during the growing season. This requires you to fertilize every year. So how we amend is, balancing the soil minerals through in-depth soil testing. We test using the Albrecht method through Logan Labs in Ohio. And what we're looking for there is to correct our imbalances, our deficiencies in our specific soil. And we want to be very aware of excesses, the Northeast, and with the amount of compost that we're using at Gaining Ground, we can get really high levels of phosphorus, which is a pollutant if it, is run off into waterways. Gaining Ground is completely surrounded by wetlands, so we wanted to be very aware of our phosphorus use. So there's no single recipe for amending. You know, it'd be very specific to your soil type and how your soil tests. And Gain Ground has really benefited from the addition of, you know, potassium, sulfur, and manganese. And then fertilizing, we're providing the plants with the proper nutrition for the season. Again, there's no single recipe. And I like to create a diverse blend of fertilizers to use on the farm, just because everywhere else we're diversifying. So it only makes sense to me to use a diverse blend of fertilizer, because then you get the benefits of products like chicken manure, alfalfa meal, and kelp meal. The nitrogen will be released at different times and provide different, you know, nutrients for the plant when the plant needs it. So really understanding what your plant needs, when it needs it, and how your plants are growing, you know, goes to what Jen said, a lot of watching and observing, and then making those changes over time. So you can do all of those things, but we've really found that the biology is the most important piece in this soil fertility and no-till. You know, biologically active soil is what drives the fertility. You grow big, healthy plants, you're harvesting, you're leaving those plant roots in the ground to decompose. As they decompose, they're feeding the soil web. The soil web redistributes these nutrients, which creates more fertility. Then you're planting your next crop immediately after that. You know, Jen said 24 hours to 4 days. Ours is more like 1 day to 7 days. But when the next crop goes in, that fertility is there. Those microorganisms are there and ready to feed the roots of the new plants going in. This creates a bigger, healthier plant in your next succession, which takes in more photosynthesis and more carbon, which then creates this huge feedback loop that is then feeding the microorganisms that go out and get more nutrients for your next crop. So we like to think of our cash crops as just as good as planting cover crop. At the same time, we're growing a harvestable crop. We're increasing soil health, organic matter, and fertility in the soil. Here's a great slide from Elaine Ingham that really drives home to me that this is important to me, that there's life in the soil.
Here, Doug.
Sorry about that, Doug.
That's good.
Okay.
1 more minute.
Sure. Great. So in season, so here's the farm in season, just some quick photos and a plain view of the season. So no-till strategies, we have permanent beds. There's 400 permanent beds on the farm. There's 30 inches, 18 inches wide. We use occultation when they're not in production, which is the use of silage tarps. We want to add compost and cover crop. Broad forking is the most aggressive act on the soil. And the real important thing is to develop weed control strategies. This is as important as your crop plan. And I feel like this one gets dropped, you know, you kind of react. Instead, we come out with a strategy for weed control, and there's no bare soils ever on the farm. Creating the seed bed. This is broad forking, adding compost and fertilizer that gets, you know, lightly incorporated into the top 1/4 to 1/2 inch of the soil. Just a quick before and after. So this is when we used to grow potatoes 5 years ago. A little bit of grass in the pathway there. You know, we removed the tarp after 7 days, broad fork, and there's that field of lettuce, you know, some of this lettuce is older, 21 days later. For long season crops, we're keeping the soil covered by using reusable landscape fabric and mulches. We have salt marsh hay in the paths, and then our bed tops are covered with landscape fabric. And setting up the market garden, being able to have these field blocks, we've been able to invest in these hedgerows, which increase biodiversity. So we have 20 field blocks around the farm, and around every field block are 2 hedgerows. of perennial, native, drought tolerant, medicinal, culinary plants that are in the hedgerows. They increase pollinators, bird habitat for eating pests, habitat for beneficial insects, create windbreaks when the hedgerows get to full grown. They're windbreak, they add heat during the shoulder seasons and keep it cooler in the summertime. And real important, last thing, winterization. So the use of cover crops, tarps when beds come out late. Winter kill options are some oats and peas. You can plant really early into those. Rye clover for late season, where we weren't mowing. We were just crimping this crop, tarping it for 4 weeks, and then planting into the residue of the rye clover, creating cover crop cocktail mixes for your specific soil and farm. And minimal soil disturbances, mulches, leaves and salt marsh hay in the pathways. And great, thank you. So if you want to learn more about Gaining Ground, there's their website, gainingground.org. And here's my contact information at the new farm in Vermont, breadseedfarm@gmail.com. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you very much, Doug. We'll hear from Noah next. So if you want to end your screen share there, great. Welcome, Noah Kellerman of Alprilla Farm in Essex, Massachusetts.
Can you all see an opening slide there?
Looks good.
All right. So thanks for coming to this talk. My name's Noah. I farm in Essex, Mass, which was inhabited by the Agawam people before colonization. And we're going into our 11th season growing on our farm. We're in some ways newcomers to reduced tillage. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience of increasing the amount of our land that we do not till and decreasing the frequency of tillage, and how we're beginning to build a somewhat extensive crop rotation where we reduce inputs and use biology to build fertility rather than relying on brought-in compost or other amendments. Just a quick overview of our farm. Our focus is on storage crops. We no longer market anything except some beef over the summer. We have a CSA that runs October through February, and that's about a little less than half of our gross sales. The rest was wholesale to restaurants and now is online monthly sales. Because it's mostly just me and Sophie with a part-time 1 day a week crew through the season and one full-timer in the fall, we need to farm pretty extensively. And even though we only grow 4 acres of vegetables a year and 2 acres of grain, because we're spread thin with haymaking and moving pasture, we need to be pretty mechanized. Our soil health has always been a priority, and that led us about 5 years ago to start to move towards using draft power whenever possible instead of tractor. I realized that a lot of the work I was doing with a tractor was undoing the damage that I was doing with a tractor, or attempting to, and that seemed pretty dumb. We're on heavy clay soil, so that keeps us on a very short leash compaction-wise, especially when things are wet. Our crop rotation is about 2 years in vegetables and 1 year in grain, which is then underseeded to clover. And so we're a few years into experimenting with reduced tillage. This past year, I don't have to tell anybody, was challenging. And the experience of almost running out of irrigation water in the middle of June before most of our crops were even planted forced us to do experiments and take a leap where we wouldn't have been brave enough otherwise, to keep the ground covered more, to plant without disturbing, to find ways of starting with a clean slate without turning the whole thing over. And we sort of threw a lot of spaghetti at the wall, and some of it stuck. And the rest of this quick presentation is just going to be what seems like what could become a sample crop rotation moving forward. We're sort of still operating on the concept of rotational tillage, which is something that the Rodale Institute talks about, where the idea on an extensive, larger mechanized scale is that you can go a number of years without any soil disturbance, but periodically you may need some just to kind of do a reset on some perennial weeds if they begin to get an upper hand. We're also influenced by the work of Eric and Ann Nordell, where they use cover crops and crop rotation to reduce weed pressure. One of their concepts is the idea of skim plowing, where even though you're using a moldboard plow, which can be probably the most destructive implement on the farm, if you are able to take a 2 or 3 inch slice of soil and neatly invert it and leave the rest of the soil column undisturbed, you're basically doing what a tilther or power harrow would be doing on a more market garden sized reduced tillage operation. So the first year of our rotation, you've got red clover, and we have been plowing it. Our crop production is pretty traditional this way. We grow potatoes in the first year. That fertility really, really helps. I feel like potatoes are sort of a good crop if you're going to do tillage, because the harvest involves disturbance of the soil anyway. So you at least aren't doubling up your disturbance. We then harvest. And we actually this year, after some conversations with Jen over last winter, began to experiment a little bit with no-till potatoes. In this slide, we mowed red clover really tight to the ground, used a shovel to plant our seed potatoes. We then waited a week for the seed potatoes to just think about germinating. And while they were still below the surface, we solarized. So we used greenhouse plastic to cook off the tops of the red clover that had just started to regrow. We then immediately mulched with leaves and waited for it to come up. It was a mixed success. There was not quite as much fertility available as there would have been from mineralizing our cover crop all at once, but it was very encouraging. I think we could have gotten around that with some amending. And so that's an exciting alternative where we might have even been able to reduce that single active, to eliminate that single active tillage in future rotations. After potato harvest, we would put in a winter annual cover crop using our no-till drill. So we would just smooth the field out minimally and come in and plant. A no-till drill is different than a conventional till drill, only in that it has these heavy coulters. It has a very heavy frame and coulters that go in front of each planter unit and slice through any residue and loosen the soil just a little bit to get the seed in the ground. Cover crop that we have really come to appreciate is winter rye and Austrian winter pea. We planted around the 3rd week of September, and we really, in a mulch grown in place system such as this, we realized that the cover crop is at least as important as the cash crop, and we actually will feed the cover crop to get a good lush weed suppressing cover. We then terminate the cover crop with a roller crimper. This is a home built one I made back in college for a class. We really like mounting it on the front end of the tractor because we can apply down pressure. And once the rye and peas are in full flower, they're very easy to kill by breaking the stems. If it's done correctly, no occultation or solarizing is needed. The stuff is dead and you've got a mulch in place. Then this is probably counts as tillage, but it's been a compromise we need to take. We then run through with this ripper. We've had issues with slow nitrogen mineralization at the beginning of the season. So we wanted to find a way of getting a little bit of starter fertilizer in, as well as making it easier to plant. So we just have a disc hiller mounted on a toolbar, followed by a shank that I believe is designed for knifing anhydrous ammonium into the ground on big conventional farms. I found it in a neighbor's barn. And then we've got a big sheet metal funnel on top. And so I can put it in a low gear and someone can sprinkle a starter fertilizer like peanut meal, crab flour, or chicken manure in, and it goes right down into the root zone of the transplant.
Noah, about
Yes.
5 more minutes.
I'll speed it up. So we get some squash. After harvesting the squash, we drill in barley, winter barley, which we then harvest. And then at this point, we could take 2 directions in this crop rotation. We could either turn it around and plant for a late season vegetable like fall brassicas, or we could no-till drill in a winter-killed cover crop such as sorghum Sudan and sun hemp, or oats and peas and daikon, to then do an early planted crop the following season. That would be a good way to grow all of the fertility that the subsequent crop would need if you get a good bunch of legumes in the mix. Additionally, if the field is weedy or there's a lot of spilled grain that could volunteer, it might be a good time to solarize or occult to clean it up. This year, because this field had access to irrigation and the field we intended to plant our cabbage in did not, we opted to plant it immediately. So we ripped beds and mulched with the straw that we had just harvested from the barley. And we had to add most of the fertility that that crop would need because there hadn't been a legume cover crop. Success was mixed. We really struggled with volunteer barley, but I think it was a decent proof of concept. This is our onion crop. We've been growing onions without tillage for a couple of years. So if we had taken the plan B on that and gotten a winter-killed cover crop, we would be looking at a scene like this the following April, where we put down a thin layer of compost and crab flour, and then mulch with salt marsh hay that we rake out of the salt marsh ourselves. Transplant onions. We've found that we not only need to irrigate very, very little, but we have a lot less weed control to do than we ever did before we started growing onions no-till. And because they have a lot of room in this system, it's more extensive. That helps with having enough water and reducing the amount of fertility needed. And then we would, after harvesting the onions, solarize and put in another cover crop to start the cycle over, cover crop or winter grain. So that in a nutshell is a place that I could see extensive organic crop rotation being developed around either rotational or complete no-tillage. This slide is a quick list of people who have been influential and helpful to us, and also some books and other resources that have been really fun food for thought over the years. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Noah. And you can leave that slide up for another second while people look at it. And this leads me to another sort of background question maybe, but someone asked if we could have access to these slides, and there is the capacity at the moment if you're able to put it into that shared folder, or if it's a small presentation, there's an option to share the file directly in the chat. I'll just let you think about that from now. So I'd like to open up the question and answer period. There are a number of questions that came through in the chat. I think now is a good time. Noah, you can end your screen share.
Okay.
We'll get all of our faces back together. I think I'll start from the top. The first question came from Richard Robinson and was asking Jen, could you describe your compost spreader and how you use it in your operation?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Richard. Let's see. The compost spreader is new to us up until this year. For the last 15 years, we were just using 5-gallon buckets. In a 50-foot bed, it's like 6 to 8 5-gallon buckets to spread by hand, and we would do that down the center of the aisle. It's about 4 cubic feet of compost, and then we would use an iron rake to smooth that out. This year, we made the investment into using the BCS compost spreader. I can pull up a picture if you'd like to see that. Let's see. And that we actually did that. I was talking to Noah about this the other day because we did it in a moment where we were really struggling with bringing our farm crew on early on in the season because of COVID, and so we actually made the choice to make this investment into the compost spreader. This image here is, you can see the way that the compost spreader works is actually within our 30-inch aisles, and so the tires stay, sorry, 30-inch bed space, so the tires stay within the 12-inch aisle range. It spreads it really evenly, as you can see from this image. So we do a U-barring prior to doing the compost application. And because we actually already had our field set up so that between each 50-foot stretch of beds, we have a 2.5-foot wide pathway that's in cover crop. We're able to work with bringing the compost spreader up and then circulating it back around without disturbing other crops. So it's been a huge investment. We actually we were tracking over time the use of it on the farm. There was a significant increase in efficiency, and really I was most concerned about the impact of compaction of the soil. And what we were finding when we were actually doing side-by-side experiments during the season, that by actually switching from the composting with bucket method, we were creating less impaction on the soil because it was just one pass with the compost spreader as opposed to multiple footsteps and heavy buckets and wheelbarrow use in the field.
And a couple of questions about that is like, what's the capacity of that BCS spreader, and about the size of the wheel extension that you have on the BCS to place the wheels in the aisles?
The wheel extension, so okay, the capacity of it is we can actually, you know what, we do it so that it's enough just to fill one bed, and that's about the capacity. It's a smaller, I'm not like well versed in BCS at all, so there are probably other options, but when we are doing a 50-foot bed, it is almost filled to its capacity for us to be able to do that one pass. And then The width of it is about 36 inches wide, so that it's reaching beyond the 30-inch beds.
Now, are there extensions on the wheels to make that span wider? That's the standard.
That's just the standard of it. Yeah. I think there are different scales of BCS, and this one that we chose actually that comes as a standard.
And then, Jen, while we are on the topic sort of with you, we got a question from either Yoko or Alex of Asawaga Farm about your irrigation of lettuce in the summers. The question was, is it one watering for lettuce all through the summer? Do you shade cloth them or protect them at all?
No, we do grow lettuce throughout the summer, but there are very few varieties that can handle the summer heat. So what we've learned over the years is that we scale back on the lettuce that we're growing. We can do salad mix throughout the summer, but it's not our main cash crop. And then we have a few varieties of lettuce. Red Sails and Skyphos in particular do well, and we do scale back. There's like a period of time in August, like a 3-week period in time that we have very little to no lettuce heads. But other than that, we're able to do it throughout the rest of the season.
And Richard entered into the chat, compost spreader capacity is 6.5 cubic feet, so a quarter of a yard. Does that sound like?
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to take note of that. Thank you.
And
yeah,
Mac,
so if we're using about 4 cubic yards for a 50-foot bed, we do, similar to Doug, we do a significant amount of composting in our beds, and have been able to increase our organic matter, through our biological practices up to 14% now. And so 6.5 cubic feet is a little bit more than what we need for a 50-foot bed.
And Mac asked if you knew which model BCS it was. They're thinking of this year.
I'll let you know, Mac, because I'm not great with the mechanics. It's so new to me. I will let you. I can let you know probably during this and put it into the chat.
Great. So actually, while we're on the topic of compost, Donald Sutherland during Doug's presentation asked how much, how often, and what type of compost were you incorporating?
Yep, so we were purchasing the bulk compost, which is the base of potting soil from Vermont Compost Company. They would truck down 40-yard loads at a time. We would get 3 of those per season, kind of spread out as we needed them. So 1 in March, 1 in June, and 1 in July. Per bed, we were putting down, initially, we started with 1 to 2 inches as they transition to no-till production, and as of last, we were adding a yard that's 21 5-gallon buckets. We were adding 2/3 of a yard, I don't know in cubic feet, so about 16 5-gallon buckets for an 80-foot bed. We're on everything is 80 feet at gaining ground. So 1 5-gallon bucket for 5 linear row feet. And then the last, this 2020, we're just focusing on problem areas. If we don't like the soil structure or a long season heavy feeder is going in, we're no longer just adding it to adding it. We're really focusing where and when the compost goes down.
Great. Another question for you, Doug, was about the volunteers that you used at Gaining Ground Farm. So Amanda Carrier asked, what is the biggest difference in your volunteer operations when you switched to no-till? Did you find that you needed more volunteers to do that work? And do you have volunteers throughout the season extension as well?
Yeah, so the simplest answer would be they went from probably 75% weeding, hand weeding, crawling on the hands and knees on the ground, to 75% harvest. That's the simplest answer. But we found when we were tractor farming, we were working ourselves out of volunteer needs. So there wasn't enough jobs for them, which was a kind of a tipping point. We either had to change our volunteer program or switch our farming practices, and we chose farming practices. So, you know, like Jen said, moving the compost is a big undertaking each season. So moving compost is a terrific volunteer job, and moving tarps around. But number one is, yeah, just transition from, we spend all our time harvesting now versus, you know, hand weeding 7 years ago. As for season extension, currently we're not doing volunteers. The volunteer program runs April 1st through November 1st. And we have, you know, in the past, it was myself and one other full-time farmer. We did the harvesting and washing and stuff in the hoop house for a season extension.
I can add a little quick piece in terms of weed control. We have just found that the more intensive that we are growing, the less weeds are being allowed to surface, and over time, the less that we are disturbing the soil. We're also not bringing up weeds, the sleeping weeds that are lying. In addition to that, we will actually utilize weeds that are growing in given areas as a green manure. So we ideally just knock down weeds with shuffle hose or wire weeders when they're just like a couple inches tall, and then just keep them in place as a green manure, and prioritize that on sunny days.
Great, thanks. No? Do you want to?
Yeah, we have also found, I think the best way to characterize how our labor's changed, labor needs have changed, is that we front load work rather than have maintenance on crops throughout the growing season. So for instance, with the roller crimper rye system, I put a lot more effort into establishing that cover crop. The previous fall, I put a lot of work into spreading seaweed on the cover crop in the middle of the winter, which was a great time to go to the beach and shovel seaweed. And it took a lot more effort and ingenuity to get the crop into the ground in the spring. And then basically we walked away. So I didn't do anything to that crop between the middle of June and when I drove out there with a squash bin and started chucking squash in it. Aside from take row cover off, I guess I could say. Same with the onions. We front loaded all of the work in April, got it planted, and then aside from a few sprays and a little bit of irrigation and a minimal amount of hand weeding, I think we spent maybe 8 or 10 person hours on that crop weeding, which is not a lot for organic onions. It was kind of smooth sailing. So it really is a front loading of the work, sometimes at times of the year that in a conventional tillage system, you can't even get in the field at all, which is great. You spread out the workload and do it when it's sane.
That's a really great point, Noah. Thank you. You're right. I can echo that.
And that sort of leads into a question from Mark about, you know, the transition to no-till and profitability. Are you able to, you know, see a difference in that, in, for example, distribution of labor or, you know, other labor savings tools? And then have you, the other half of Mark's question was, have you been able to get better prices when marketing regenerative practices?
I have not been able, I have not tried to market it different. I mean, we haven't really shifted the whole way we do things, and we're already getting an organic premium. So in that respect, no, we're not seeing a return. But as far as profitability goes, not having a crop failure was really great this year. And so that resilience equals profitability as I see it. The roller crimper method is certainly lower input and cheaper for planting winter squash than either conventionally tilled or brought in mulch. If you bring in the mulch, it's going to be a more expensive way of growing squash. But if you can grow your mulch in place, till it mechanically and plant mechanically, you're actually getting better economies of scale and lower input costs than the big chemical intensive growers are. Examples are like Gabe Brown out in the Dakotas, growing commodity grain and still doing it profitably with biological no-till.
Great.
I can speak a little bit to that. And I mean, I think Doug actually gave some really great examples of increasing yields for poundage, which I was talking to Noah about how I've never been able to like actualize numbers that way. We think about how our yields have increased over years as we continue to maintain and improve upon systems. And so, you know, we'll look at 6 years ago, we were feeding 500 households, now then went up to 700,000 households. This year was over 1,000 households per week. And that's all on the same amount of land. It's the same footprint of less than an acre and a third. And so I do think that, you know, the way that we are able to increase some profitability is how we are managing the land, because our yields are increasing over time. Our pests and our disease pressures have gone down significantly to, you know, almost none. Our biggest pest issue is, that we still struggle with are flea beetles. But we find that as we are working more in relationship with the land, that there is this mutual flourishing that happens. There's a balance, and that translates into higher yields and also more beautiful and long-standing crops. So we actually have for the wholesale that we do, we in our area, we actually charge more than any other farm does. And the people that we work with are willing to pay that amount more because they know that they're actually getting no shrinkage from our crops. Our crops come in really beautiful. Their post-harvest has been well cared for. They maintain well within the cooler spaces, and people want to buy them really quickly because they're beautiful. They like emit an energy. People will speak about like being able to feel the difference in our produce, and so people have no problem with paying a little bit more for the vibrancy of our product.
We quantify everything at gain and ground by weight. We have been tracking estimated sales value. So, I mean, certainly the yields have grown dramatically, and we're growing higher value crops. But, you know, we're a nonprofit, we don't sell anything. So all I can speak is on yield results, which have increased, you know, by double since no-till, easily by double.
Great, thank you. Alexis asked about your observations and insight about how transitioning to no-till has affected your pest and disease pressure. Jen, you mentioned that. Doug and Noah, would you like to talk a bit about that?
Sure. In our limited experience, I've seen, I think on the onions, there's a lot less thrips, to be specific, because having mulch underneath them makes a great habitat for spiders and other predators. We still have some thrips because if you're growing grain near onions, you're going to have thrips. But it wasn't nearly as devastating as it would have been on bare ground, as I've seen it be other years. Our potatoes, the no-till experiment got beetles too, but it could have also been that that was just such a small area we did that it was too small to not have bleed over. And on our squash, I think it's safe to say that we've had less disease and pest, although we've had a significant problem with vine borers in our squash over the years that's been increasing. And I know that the pupae are vulnerable to tillage. It actually, on the UMass website, says to deep plow your squash field after you harvest, which I'm not about to go out and do. But that may be an instance where we have increased pest pressure. Another pest that I actually wanted to ask both Doug and Jen about is if winter cutworm is an issue on either of your farm, because it's been a real problem on our no-till fall brassicas.
Yeah, no, we haven't experienced that as of yet with crop rotation in our, fall brassicas, but anecdotally, I do see a decrease in disease and insect pressure across the farm each year, exponentially better. And for one example is flea beetles, just because everyone would be familiar with this one. 5-6 years ago, we used to take the time to shovel in the whole perimeter of the remay that was, covering the, greens that were underneath the remay. And that each year we've been able to get a little bit more lax with that process. Year one, we were shoveling the whole perimeter of the remay to make sure nothing got in there. Fast forward to year 3, we're just dropping some sandbags every now and again. And now year 5, the remay blows off for 2 or 3 days. The arugula or baby gillnex is pretty much unscathed from flea beetle. And that's a huge victory for us to be able to grow without flea beetle damage.
Yeah, we, specific to flea beetles, row covers is what we will utilize. What we have found is similar to what Doug was speaking to. We used to have to keep row covers on for almost the entire life cycle of the crop, and now we actually only have to keep it on for a period of time. Once the crop reaches a certain threshold, after basically its first harvest, we're able to take the row covers off. And then what Noah, you were speaking to the winter cutworm. We found that it significantly shifted when we became really tight about our rotation schedule. And so not, like any brassica family crop, we were keeping away from a given area for 4 seasons to start with. Now with how intensely we are having our crop rotation within a given season, sometimes we can have anywhere from 1 to 4 cycles of a given bed space within the season. But every time we're doing that, we are doing a compost amending application and just not shying on the compost, which enables us to, next year, because there's already been 4 cycles, we can then move back into brassicas. And that has really significantly helped us with the winter cutworm.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah.
We are running right up to, it's 10:32. And so I think we're going to wrap it up now. I know I didn't get to all your questions. Lynn and Donald had some more that we didn't get to, though we are hosting the next session in the same room shortly. So we can probably get to some of those questions there. I just thought I'd remind everyone that we have a monthly, now it's on Zoom, but a monthly call or Zoom for people who are interested in speaking more about no-till and reduced tillage methods. That happens every Monday, the first Monday, of every month at 7 p.m. And that I will copy here into the chat. If you want to get signed up for that, go ahead and email caro@nofamass.org, and it will be, it's a great resource. A lot of these folks here are on that call every month. So it's a great chance to just, put our heads together and hear what everyone's doing. But that's it for this session. So I look forward to seeing you in the next session.